Well, good morning, church. I want to welcome those of you that are visiting with us today. We are so glad you're here. My name's Phil Shields. I'm one of the teaching pastors here at Wheaton Bible Church. And I want to give a special welcome to those that are worshiping with us in our traditional service. And then for those that are going to be watching this online later this week, welcome. We're so glad that you are here with us. Well, we're in our final week of our series titled, What Would You Ask Jesus? And we're going to be dealing with an interesting subject today. And so as we dive into this, I want to invite you to take your copy of the scriptures and open to John 11. John 11, and just put your finger there. We're going to jump into that here in a minute. So when we were deciding who was going to be preaching each of the messages that were coming in this series, the teaching team decided to take straws. And so we did that to figure out who had the most bruises in their life right now to take this subject matter. And for some reason, it landed with me. And so we get the fun opportunity to dive into the subject of suffering. See, suffering isn't easy. And for some of you, you're entering here today, and you are in the midst of suffering. For others of you, you're going to be heading into that type of a season here, or maybe you've just come out of it, but I don't know where you are. But I want you to know this, that as I come here this morning, I want you to know that I am standing with you. I'm speaking not only to you, but to myself. Because for me, I feel like this subject is hitting way too close to home for me and my family. Over the last couple years, this has been something that we have struggled through. And so as we have been diving into this week, I just want you to know, if that's where you are, if you're in those seasons of suffering, I'm standing with you. I'm praying for you. And so as we pray, I want to make sure that we are praying that as we leave here, we leave resting in the secure care of our Heavenly Father. So I want to invite you as we jump into this to stand with me as we read God's holy word and we stand out of reverence for this sacred text. And so we're going to be looking at John 11, starting in verse 17. You can follow along with me. It says this, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him? But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man. By this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out! The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Father, I ask that you would speak through your word, that you would bring peace, and that you would bring comfort and wisdom to all of us here this morning. And so we give you this time, Lord, to speak whatever you want to speak into our hearts. It's your name I pray. Amen. You may be seated. So when you think about your life, you can think back over some pretty significant things that have entered your life, or you can think about some less significant things that have entered. But when you think over your life, you're going to remember times that you have moved through spaces that have led you into places of great joy, great laughter, times of uncertainty, times of wondering what is going to come next. You've had times of hope, and the list could go on and on and on. As you think about these doorways that you have entered, one of the things that all of us in this room are going to enter at some point in our life is the doorway of suffering. We are promised that because we live in a broken world, we are going to deal with suffering, and suffering is going to come, and it's going to impact you in profound ways. So as I've been reading this text and processing what is happening there, what Jesus is doing, there's a thought that keeps coming back to me as I've struggled through my times of suffering and then looking at this, and it's a simple principle that I think we all have to process and understand. And it's this. It's that suffering is the doorway to deeper dependence on the grace and presence of Jesus. Suffering is the doorway to deeper dependence on the grace and presence of Jesus. See, if you were to go back to the beginning of John 11, what you're going to find is that Lazarus, this man, is sick. And his sisters send this message to Jesus for him to come and to be with this one that he loves so dearly. See, this text ends up revealing how much Jesus ends up loving Mary and Martha and Lazarus, but this text also reveals how much he loves you. It reveals his love for humanity. And so the message comes, and Jesus doesn't leave right away. He ends up processing things a little bit, and then eventually tells his disciples, we're going to go back, and we're going to be there. And the reason this happens is he ends up telling his disciples this, and there's great tension. See, Jesus had been in this area before, and when he was there, people wanted to stone him. People wanted him arrested. There was a lot of turmoil that was stirring up. And so the disciples said, we'll go back with you. And the reason they're going to go back is they think that they're going to go back and they're going to die with Jesus in this area. They're going to die with Jesus in Bethany. And so for Jesus, what he was doing is he was going back and entering a place that he was going to spend time with loved ones. But more importantly, it was going to start his path to the cross. Because what happens there ends up fast-forwarding everything that's going to lead him to the cross. Now, by the time that Jesus enters Bethany, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. Now, it was a Jewish custom for the Jewish people, that when somebody died, they would continue to go back to the tomb for 3 days. Every day they would go back. And the reason they would go back is because they were going to make sure that the person was actually dead. It seems strange, but they didn't have all the medical devices that we have. And so they would go back, and it was to make sure. But there was also this other thought in the Jewish custom, was that when a person died, the spirit of that person would hover over the body for 3 days. And so the spirit would hover, looking for a possible re-entry into the body. And in the 3rd day, when the person was dead, the color would start to leave the body. And when the 3rd day was done, then the spirit would leave. That was the custom that was taking place. So John is writing to make sure that his Jewish readers, and for us today, understand that this wasn't an aspect where Jesus was going to come back and resuscitate him. This was something where Jesus was going to go, and Lazarus was dead, and a resurrection was going to take place. John wanted his readers to understand this. And so we end up seeing this very thing that we all hate to deal with, and it's the subject of death. See, for Martha and Mary, this was a brother, and they were mourning a brother who had died, but it had severe implications for them. See, Lazarus was probably the wage earner for the family. He was the one that probably made the money for the family that was there. And in a male-dominated society, it meant that when Lazarus died, for Martha and Mary, the future was uncertain. They didn't know what was going to take place next, what was going to happen the next day. And so what we end up finding as we look at these two sisters is that suffering ends up impacting us emotionally, it impacts us physically, and it wreaks havoc on our thought life. I would imagine that if you're entering here today and you are in a season of suffering, the thoughts that are racing through your mind are going crazy. And so I think for us this morning, as we're looking at this text, we need to say, okay, out of John 11, how would we define suffering? How would we define this term, this thing that we end up going through? I think this is a definition that we can give to suffering. It's this: the pain that we face when life doesn't go according to our physical needs or our physical desires, the plans we have, the dreams we have, the intentions, or the expectations that we have in our life. Because when those things don't go right, pain sets in, suffering comes. And so when suffering is defined this way, it means that we're going to end up entering doorways that we did not ask for. We didn't ask for this pain. We didn't ask for this to come. And it's not the things that we wanted. And so for Martha and Mary, they're saying this was not the time that Lazarus was supposed to die. They didn't choose that. And the suffering that you will enter is something that you won't choose either. But maybe what God allows is that suffering comes, and sometimes God's growing of you may come wrapped up in pain. The growing of you may come wrapped up in pain. And so in that growing, it means that we have many doors that we're going to face as we go through that season of pain. And so I want you to see that there's some doorways that we enter just like Martha and Mary do. So we're going to look at the doorways of suffering. And the first doorway that we need to see is the doorway of loss. We all are going to face the doorway of loss at times. In October of 2013, my mom was diagnosed with dementia. And for the next 6 years, we watched her suffer, and I also watched as my family suffered the implications of that diagnosis. In June of this year, my mom passed away, and I can remember processing that week, and the day after her funeral, I was standing right here before you. See, I was struggling to figure out. I knew my mom would want me to preach God's word, but I was also struggling to figure out how to walk through the doorway of loss that had just entered my life. And yet, those are the losses that we are going to face. And for some of you, these are the losses that you're facing right now. I can remember the day the diagnosis of autism entered our family. When those words were delivered, my life, the things that I was thinking, all of a sudden it changed all my desires and hopes, and it moved to something that I had no possible understanding of. I had to enter the doorway of loss, and the loss of what was to be has hit me over and over and over again. See, when suffering hits you, you never just suffer the thing that you're suffering, but you also suffer the loss that the suffering brings. So something hits, but it means that there's going to be other things that are lost. So it could be the person or the days or the traditions or the celebrations or all of the things that get wrapped up with whatever that thing that is taking place, and it becomes different. You never just suffer the one thing, you always have to suffer the losses that come with it. And so for Mary and Martha, the loss meant the loss of a brother. What we end up seeing is in verse 18 and 19 that Jesus comes, and what we find is that many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of a loved one and the loss of many other things that were to come. And so the community gathers around them. See, Lazarus' absence meant their life was going to be different from that moment forward. And I would imagine the dreams that they had, the things that they thought were going to take place, all of a sudden were radically changed. See, when we enter the doorway of loss, it changes us. And so the tendency in our broken bodies is that we go to this doorway and we focus so much on the loss that it's hard for us to see anything else. And when your mind fills with loss, it ends up becoming a stagnant life, and it reveals the reality of what you have been trusting in all along. There's an incredible book that I am recommending that you go buy today. If you're in a season of suffering, I want to encourage you to go buy it at our bookstore. They have extra copies for you, and it's a book called Suffering by Paul Tripp. In the book, Tripp ends up making this comment. Suffering or loss has the power to expose what you have been trusting all along. Your suffering or loss is more powerfully shaped by what's in your heart than by what's in your body or in the world around you. So when we start looking at this, suffering means that you're going to enter the doorway of loss. But you have to be reminded that it's not the final destination. That's not the place that you're going to stay. So the sisters are processing loss in this text. You're processing it. But I want to encourage you that as you enter, you don't just sit and you focus on the loss. You end up looking out ahead at the person of Jesus Christ. What we end up finding is the sisters eventually go to Jesus. And what we see is that it seems like they are shocked. And so I want to ask you, are you shocked by your loss? Are you shocked by the suffering that you're going through right now? And if you are, how are you handling that with Jesus? There's a second doorway in suffering. So you go through the doorway of loss, and often as you go through the doorway of loss, it leads to another doorway. And that other doorway is the doorway of complaint. It's the doorway of complaint. And if we look at it, we end up looking at how we complain in life, and I would imagine this. We have some people here that are really good at complaining. For some reason, complaining comes very natural to us. And when suffering hits, complaining goes to an all new level. You might miss it in the text whenever you read this, but what we find is that as scholars have looked at this, a lot of the text ends up saying that Martha and Mary end up complaining. They end up complaining. Look at what is said here in verse 21. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. If you would have listened to us, if you would just get your timing better. I mean, she's asking, where were you? We sent for you. You were supposed to be here. Now, let me tell you, my Jesus handles complaints really well and has handled a ton of my own complaints. But eventually, when we are complaining, you better expect Jesus to step in and to speak into those complaints. And notice what he does when he's talking to Martha. He doesn't deal with the timing. He deals with his identity. And it's as if he comes back at Martha and he says, your complaint is because your will wasn't done. But my will is for you. My will is for you. So when we look at this in verse 25, Jesus ends up declaring, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And so the doorway of complaint leads to Jesus revealing himself to Martha and revealing that he is an anchor in life. He's saying, Martha, I'm your anchor because I am the resurrection. I am the life. And what ends up happening is that when Martha says this, these complaints end up being statements of wondering where Jesus is. And I would imagine for you today, some of you, as you go through suffering, you're saying, where are you? Where have you been? Why aren't you here? But Jesus ends up replying with hope. So some statements are made, and they're transformational statements. But then Mary comes and falls at Jesus' feet. And look at what she ends up saying. Lord, wait, the same thing. If you had been here, your timing is off. Why weren't you here? Now, I want you to see something. The word if is not a foundational word. See, if is never a steady space for us to be standing on. It's never a great place to be. And so Martha brings this sorrowful complaint, and Mary ends up bringing this exhausted mourning complaint. And when we look at it, what we see is that when they use the word if, it's never a solid ground. They're saying, what if? What if this happens? What if that happens? Why weren't you here? And instead of arguing, Jesus ends up approaching Mary and stands in the grief with her. In both instances, Jesus allows us to enter the doorway of complaint and to bring our complaints. He never corrects the women. He never corrects them. But what he ends up doing is he points them to who he is. See, what's happening is that when we go through the doorway of complaint, we're losing an aspect of peace within us. So I want to encourage you, I want you to understand that the central thing that Satan wants to do to you today is he wants you to be asking, where are you, God? Where are you? Why aren't you here? And the further we go down those complaints, what we end up seeing is that it ends up leading us to a stagnant and stale life. This is why we have to understand that suffering is the doorway to deeper dependence on the grace and presence of Jesus. Now, there's a third doorway. And the third doorway is this the doorway of limited perspective. And we see this in verse 39. Many of us are going to go home today and this week, and we're going to watch football. And one of the things that we love, it's probably sick of us at times, but we love it when the guy is running down the field and has no clue somebody's coming from the other direction and they get blown up. We love it. But what we find in that play is that the person that was running with the ball ends up realizing that they had a limited perspective. They didn't see what was happening. They didn't see who was coming. And the same applies to your life. Whenever we have a limited perspective, our life is going to blow up in the midst of suffering. See, Jesus spoke to Martha and said to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. And what does Martha do? She says, I believe that. I believe that you are the Messiah. And then they get to the tomb and to the grave. And look at what ends up happening. Jesus says, take away the stone. But Lord, Martha says, by this time there's a bad odor, for he has been there for 4 days. Now, why is that key? It's key because what was happening is that her limited perspective was being focused on the physical presence instead of the eternal person that was standing in front of her. She was more concerned with an odor than saying, is Jesus going to do something here? And so whenever we look at this, what we have to understand is that Jesus is saying to you today that he is the resurrection and the life. And here's what I want you to get here, is that you understand that your suffering is an indicator. It's an indicator of where you live, but not whose child you are. If you are a follower of Jesus, the suffering you're going through is just an indicator of where you live, but it does not declare whose child you are. And when you are a child of the King, you are not defined by your suffering. You're not defined by that. But in your suffering, you enter the limited perspective to get a focus and to look around and to say, what is the perspective that I need to have on the glorious God that I serve? And so we enter these 3 doorways as we go through suffering, and I would imagine for some of you, you have entered those throughout your life or you're in those right now. And I want you to know it's okay to mourn. It's okay to process loss. I get it. But I want you to know that whenever we read this and we look at the suffering that's taking place, what we end up seeing is that Jesus ends up saying, but hold on. As you go through those doorways, I'm going to go with you, and I am the doorway of hope. And for some of us, we might be saying right now, well, how do I trust Jesus? Because this is really hard. This is so difficult. And I want you to see what Jesus does to gain your trust and to reveal his identity to you. So Jesus is the doorway of hope, and what he wants to do is that he wants to enter that doorway of suffering with you. He wants to go back to the place that was going to stone him because he wants to enter this season with these sisters. He goes back to a place that in verse 53, it actually says, from that moment on, they wanted to kill him. He was willing to step into that doorway so that he was there just miles from the place that he would eventually be nailed to a cross. But he's saying, I am going to enter with you. He walks through the doorway of suffering to be with you where you are. And what does he do? He ends up in verse 32. He listens. In verse 25, he shares truth. In verse 33, he bears the pain. And in verse 44, when Lazarus walks out, what we see is that Jesus is there until the end. Jesus isn't at a distance. He's saying, I am ready to enter this with you. And so Jesus is going to enter the pain that you're feeling right now. And when he enters, he ends up doing something else. He ends up revealing hope. He ends up bringing hope to your life. And so when it hurts and you wonder what's next, Jesus knows that the only true remedy for your pain is not some other material possession. It's not some success in your life. It's not more money in your bank account. It's Him. He knows that in your suffering, what you need is Him. And so He promises to be the hope in your pain. See, what you need to understand is that when He enters and He reveals hope, what He is saying is that you don't have to go anywhere to find me. I am already here, and when I am present, there is hope found. And so Jesus reveals the hope, and the hope is Himself. I am the resurrection and the life. And the last thing He does is Jesus calls you out. He calls you out. Now, let me be clear. It doesn't mean that He's always going to remove the suffering that's happening. I mean, eventually, Lazarus ends up dying. But it does mean that He's going to call you out at different times so that you can live in His glorious presence and you can identify with Him in the midst of the suffering you're going through. And so Jesus is going to call you out, and He didn't do it. If you go back to the text, what you find is He didn't do it in a quiet voice. He did it in a loud voice. And the reason He called him out so boldly is because He is revealing that He has the power and authority over suffering, over the circumstance you're going through. And the reality is we don't like pain. We don't like it. We hate when pain comes upon us, but with Jesus, something unique takes place. See, this is what's so fascinating. It's something that I continue to have to repeat to myself because I'm going to forget it so often. But no one comes out of the unexpected, difficult, frustrating, hurtful, time-consuming, suffering unchanged. No one does. When you go through it, you are changed, but what you are going through or what you will go through is going to change you, and you don't rise out of tragedy the way you were before. It comes when Jesus comes in, because where He enters and where He calls out, He transforms every circumstance, every season, and wants to transform your life in the midst of that suffering. And so He calls out. And so I want you to think for just a moment. There's doorways that you enter every day of your life. Today, you're going to be walking through doorways. And as you walk through each door that you get to, I want you to remember that as you walk through that doorway, that the suffering that you take place is the doorway to deeper dependence on Him. So that when you walk through the doors, you're going, I'm depending on you more. When you walk through the door of your apartment or your house or the restaurant, I'm depending on Him. When you walk through the doorway of the hospital, you're depending on Him. When you walk through the doorway of your job, you're depending on Him. That every doorway you walk through takes you to a deeper dependence on who Jesus is and the grace and the presence that He brings. Because He is with you, He wants to transform your circumstance. And so may God be glorified in our difficult times, because often God does the brightest and greatest work in the darkest of times of our lives. Father, I pray that as we leave here and as many of us are dealing with seasons in our life that are extremely difficult. As we deal with things that bring so much pain, I ask that you would open our hearts and our minds to being more dependent on you. May we not seek peace anywhere else. May we understand that as you stand before us, you went to that cross to defeat suffering once and for all. You rose from the dead to give us new life. And that in the midst of the suffering that we go through, as we are completely bound up, that you want to come in and you want to say, come out. That you want to remove those chains from us. And for some of us, Lord, you want to just journey through those hard times with us, all the way through to the end. And so I pray today you would remind us of that. And so for those that are here that are in pain, Lord, I ask that you would bring peace. And it's in your name I pray. Amen.